We're on to the book of Jeremiah today, and this is another prophet who lived after Isaiah, about 100 years or so after him. And the book's nearly as big as Isaiah, actually, but there's not a lot of new stuff in here compared to how much new stuff there was in Isaiah. So I don't think we're going to take as long to get through this one. And indeed, this first video, we're doing chapters 1 to 10 in the first sitting. So basically just picking out the new bits rather than anything. I don't want to repeat too much of what we did in Isaiah. So Jeremiah, anyway, he's a priest for the king Josiah of Judah, who was one of the good kings, and then he's in the mix all the way down to the point of the Babylonian exile. This opens with a phrase from Jeremiah, or from God, I suppose, that's relayed by Jeremiah, that I gather is used in the abortion debate quite a lot as an argument for how it's in the Bible that that's not okay. And it's just Jeremiah saying that God says to him, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. And I believe that's sort of framed as the idea that there's this sort of personhood and essence and soul before someone is actually born. But it's not obvious that it works in that context because it's before you're in the womb, so it suggests a sort of predestination, almost decouples it from the idea of physicality of existence. So I think there's plenty of other stuff in the Bible you could use for that argument, but this one doesn't seem to be a particularly good one to do that. Interesting though, God does say that he has put words in Jeremiah's mouth, which goes back to that debate in terms of, okay, what does a prophet see? You know, we have weird interpretations of things, and how much of what they say is their interpretation has come from them and how much of it comes from God. And God's saying he puts the words in their mouth, almost sort of suggests an idea of accuracy. But then that being said, we have God here asking Jeremiah, what does he see in his vision, dream, whatever it is? And Jeremiah talks about he saw an olive branch, man, and a boiling pot. And apparently the boiling pot means disaster from the north. Okay. But it's basically the same problem of all that interpretation, because I say boiling pot, I think pasta for dinner. But Jeremiah sees it and it's the Babylonians coming from the north. And granted, that is what then happens. But yeah, I mean, I have a lot of trouble with this whole idea of prophecy generally. And that doesn't really help, I don't think. He then relays a big old speech from God that's talking about a slightly odd thing we haven't had much context for, that the people of Egypt and Assyria are not going to help the Israelites when the Babylonians invade. And I say, without the context, I don't really quite understand what that's getting at, but it's interesting that that is consistent with Isaiah, at least. We then have Jeremiah says that God says to him, faithless Israel has committed adultery everywhere. And this is a bit of an ongoing metaphor with this, where it's talking about the relationship between the Israelites and God being similar to a husband and wife, where the wife is unfaithful. So God is the man and Israel is the woman in that context. But the really odd bit in this one is that God apparently says, I thought that after she had done all this, she would return to me, but she did not. She, in this context, obviously being the Israelites. But that suggests that God didn't know what was going to happen, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And this does seem to be a bit of a theme with Jeremiah, because I've read 20 chapters ahead of this already. And it keeps coming back, this whole idea, well, not keeps, but there's a few references to Jeremiah suggesting that God didn't understand what was going to go on. And yeah, I mean, it makes no sense for a prophet to convey that anyway. And certainly wouldn't make sense if God existed, he wouldn't know, because outside time, therefore you can see all of it regardless without everything having to be predestined. But yeah, it's an interesting difference to Isaiah, who never seemed to suggest anything like that. It just seems clumsy and, yeah, a little bit odd. It's all framed anyway in this concept of the Israelites being unfaithful to God, and that is the problem, and this is their demise coming. And so in the next 20 chapters, that is a theme that just keeps repeating and repeating. Jeremiah would be nightmare at a party. You bring him over and you do something wrong, he is going to bang on about it all night. It also occurs at this point, because we're going up to the point of the Babylonian exile. It's just harping on this prophecy point again a little bit. Like at the minute, you can find people who will predict there's going to be problems with Taiwan at some point, and there's people who will predict it won't. Presumably, whatever is going to happen or not with that is far enough or close enough to us that we're going to see it at some stage. But whatever happens, we're going to basically forget those who predicted the opposite and were wrong, and we're going to be like, wow, the people who predicted it and were right. That's just the nature of prophecy, isn't it? And I don't know, So I just don't like prophecy as any sort of thing, and you kind of got to reject it as actual evidence for anything, other than potentially the Isaiah thing written before Jesus and sound like Jesus. I mean, that's worth taking seriously to some extent, at least. But this stuff, yeah, not so much. But it is at least very, very clear why it's happening. It's because of the Israelites worshipping other gods and that sort of thing. Although I suppose that is interesting as well, because it always boils down to that unfaithfulness to God. And that seems to be what the sin is defined as. So someone's gone off and done a naughty thing with someone they shouldn't have done or whatever. It's almost like that's not seen as that specific behaviour was the sin. The sin is the fact that was being unfaithful to God because God has asked you not to do that sort of thing. I think something like that. Chapter 9 verse 8 has an interesting bit. It just talks about, with their mouths they speak cordially, but in their hearts they set traps. That's God speaking. I just thought that's quite an interesting observation on human nature, actually, isn't it? Because there's a bit of that in probably all of us. So maybe there are people who are above that, maybe, I don't know, but to varying degrees, not setting traps that are going to kill people or whatever. But yeah, a definite potential human nature issue. Lots more repetition from there, but then it finishes on basically a prayer from Jeremiah, which includes the idea that people's lives are not their own, which is, well, that's deeply uncomfortable, isn't it? I don't really like that, but I guess that's one interpretation anyway. And then for his own faults, he asks God, discipline me, but not in anger, or you will reduce me to nothing. And then says, pour out your wrath on those who do not acknowledge you. Yeah, so I don't know, he's acknowledging he's not great, he's going to have a little bit of punishment, but not too bad, please. I suppose that's fair enough. But this idea of pouring out wrath on people who don't acknowledge God is sort of interesting, because the gut feel for that is it's very Old Testament, not very New Testament. But I saw this thing the other day, I can't remember where it was or who was saying it, but it was talking about you get to a point with people where you try and reach them or whatever it is to convince them to mend their ways. But if they don't, then it's appropriate to say, okay, God, let it rip, sort of thing. So, cliche example, but Hitler, he gets to right up to the end. I guess no one's probably tried to save his soul, have they? But you get to a point where you just say, yeah, set him on fire, put him in a ditch, and let's get this over with. And that would be a good thing because that's the ultimate outcome, and there has to be some sort of justice. I don't know, it's an interesting one, but it's kind of a big idea for just tacked on the end there with a little bit of a prayer. But on we should go anyway, and say the next video we're going to do another 10 chapters of Jeremiah, so I don't think this will take us too long to get through.